Welcome. Thanks for joining me. I'll be talking to you for the next few minutes about Middle English literature. Let's begin. So, by now, you're familiar with the idea that English incorporated words from other languages when they were more efficient than the existing English word, or if they were not an English word for the item or activity in question. This is very much the case with the French language, present in many ways in major cultural and commercial centers in England. From 1250 to 1400, a large number of French borrowings and loanwords began to show up in English usage. Of course, by the time these loanwords were recorded in text, they had likely been part of the oral language for some time, so the borrowings may have started earlier than 1250. This does not mean, by the way, that the number of French speakers were increasing. In fact, the opposite was happening. French speakers gradually became more immersed in English culture, and so they picked up the language. So if French is the language of the court, of education, of sophistication, it's also the language of art and literature, right? Well, to some degree, yes, but we also have significant English works being produced in medieval England. Aside from some exceptional texts in the early part of this period, English was entirely spoken. It came back into prominence, or dominance, I should say, in the High Middle Ages, or the 1300s to 1400s. So let's begin by talking about the manner of publication and dissemination of literature before we get into the nitty-gritty. We have surviving texts in all Middle English dialects, so it's much easier to date and locate these old texts than Old English literature. However, the majority of texts are in the East Midland dialects, which you'll remember from a previous lecture was becoming the English standard. Even as spoken English was rising to prominence in this period, scholars and writers had serious doubts as to whether English was a suitable language for writing religious, scholarly, or literary works. It seemed too humble, too plain. Naturally, some lobbied for the continued use of Latin or French. This debate would carry on through the 16th century. According to Jerry Knowles, the claim that English was not a suitable language for scripture was repeatedly made over a period of some 200 years. It was originally the outcome of the Oxford Conference of 1401, which ironically was a response to the successful translation of the Bible by the Lollards. The Lollards, you may have encountered in your readings, were supporters of John Wycliffe, the first man to translate the Latin Vulgate into English. And we'll talk more about him shortly. The real problem, Knowles says, was that the Lollard translation was too successful for the liking of the church authorities. So again, language is controlled by the powerful to keep the disenfranchised compliant. Before the printing press, however, books were a rare, expensive commodity that few could afford, which is another factor to the slow spread of literacy in medieval England. A single copy of a book could have taken a trained scribe working 12 hours a day, a month or two to produce. One astonishing record that we found was a commentary on the Bible that was about 1,272 pages long, and that commentary took 2 scribes 5 years to complete. The means of production weren't cheap either. Scribal ink came from soot from lamps, or gall in water and gum, and if you're familiar with the term, galls are the plants that grow when insects lay their eggs and berries grow, and it's very Harry Potterish. The parchment scribes originally used was made from polished calf or kid skins. So newborn and stillborn animal skins were actually the most expensive types of parchment because of their supposedly superior quality. Paper was developed as a more cost-effective alternative, but it wasn't something the average person could afford. So when we find written records from people in the lower class, we know that what they wrote was important enough because they spent the money to get this more expensive material. Literary historians break down the Middle English literary trends by 50, 100, or 150-year increments. If you'd like to pause the video to read these categories, do so, but I'm going to spend the rest of the lecture talking about significant writers and their works. The first, Geoffrey of Monmouth. Around 1136 or 1138, accounts vary, an Oxford cleric styling himself Geoffrey of Monmouth completed a chronicle entitled The History of the Kings of Britain, or Historia Regum Britanniae, derived from Geoffrey's conversations with the librarian of Malmesbury Abbey. This immensely popular, wonderfully fanciful, epic narrative of pre-Saxon British history was said to have been based on an ancient book in the British language, though no one has ever tracked down such a volume. Geoffrey of Monmouth had already compiled the prophecies of Merlin, so it was predictable that the most influential parts of this history should be devoted to the fabulous exploits of the British hero, prophesied by the Welsh wizard. Geoffrey's history also repeated some other potent national myths that will recur in the evolution of the English language. The story of King Lear and his 3 daughters, the tale of Cymbeline, King of Britain, and his daughter Imogen, and others. The Anchronwise is one of the best-known early Middle English texts. Historians value it for its documentation of evolving Middle English, but it's also noted that the work is actually enjoyable because the author shares excellent insight and wit. It is a guide of anchorites, which means that it's a conduct manual for people who would shun worldly pursuits and live in religious seclusion. It was intended for the use of 3 noble sisters. It was one of the few Middle English texts to be translated into Latin and French and not vice versa, and its adaptations are referred to as the Ancrine Rule. The text is noted for consistent spelling compared to contemporary texts of the time. Such consistency involving several texts implies regulation, and regulation is likely only through scribal training in a major center. Thus, in the Anchronwise, we encounter an early and very local example of language standardization. One of the most famous literary texts of the medieval period is Piers Plowman, written by William Langland. He's a surprisingly subversive figure for such a tightly controlled historical period. Langland was an outsider who came from the West Midlands, where Old English ideals had survived most strongly, but he had spent a life of poverty in London, serving as a humble clerk, striding the streets in a long, ragged coat. Shaven-headed and emaciated, he was strange, prophetic, and eccentric. A celebration of English individualism, though, Piers Plowman is an allegorical narrative composed in unrhymed alliterative verse. And English occasionally disparaged by contemporaries as barbarous forms of the language. Piers Plowman opens in the Malvern Hills, where a man named Will falls asleep and has a vision of a tower on a hill and a fortress in a deep valley. And between these symbols of heaven and hell, there is a fair field full of folk representing mankind. At the beginning of the poem, the humble plowman Piers, he offers himself as the narrator's guide to truth. The subsequent quest is expressed through a series of dream visions and an examination into the lives of 3 allegorical characters: Do Well, Do Better, and Do Best. Those were their actual names. His vision, however, spared no one. Friars were ignorant of scripture and concerned only with their stomachs. Pilgrims pursued prostitutes, and feudal lords kept riotous retainers. So it was a little raunchy. John Wycliffe was an early proponent of making religious teachings accessible in English. The language of the church was Latin, and priests did not translate the Mass or homilies for those in attendance who did not speak the language. And so Wycliffe didn't understand how the average person could feel a spiritual connection to God if he couldn't understand God's language? And so we can see Wycliffe's movement as this sort of precursor to Protestantism. So Wycliffe attacked the church, basically, and the privileged status of the clergy, and he chose to work with commoners. In 1388, he translated the Bible into Middle English from the Vulgate, and the Vulgate was a 4th century Latin translation that the church took as its official version. But Wycliffe was like, no, everyone can't read that, so he translated it into a version that everyone could read. He made it accessible. His followers were known as Lollards, and they believed in predestination and iconoclasm, but they opposed the veneration of saints, sacraments, transubstantiation, and the very existence of the papacy. So you can see the similarities here between Lollardism and Protestantism kind of piling up. Pearl is one of 4 works, all with moral and religious themes, which exist in a single manuscript by an unknown author. Of these, Patience and Cleanness are adaptations of scriptural narratives. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is set in the Arthurian past, and Pearl, here, is a dream vision of the author's experience. And it's the vision of a lady, apparently his recently deceased daughter, now in heaven. And the vision instructs him on the doctrine of grace and redemption. All 4 poems are written in the alliterative meter, which flourished in the North and West from the mid-14th until the end of the 15th century. Modern scholarly opinion dates the manuscript to the end of the 14th century and identifies its place of origins as an area in the Northwest Midlands. So, more familiar names for you. Both of these authors, Chaucer and Gower, are acclaimed artists and accomplished writers, but as this quote on the screen demonstrates, Chaucer is generally thought to be the more palatable or even enjoyable. Both of them wrote in the East Midland dialect, which you'll remember became the English standard. Both of them were very well connected, and they both wrote commissioned works for royalty. Gower, however, is of an elevated social status. Chaucer served a lot of roles in the English court. He was the son of a merchant, though, however, and he had to rise above his station. Chaucer was also familiar with the speech of commoners and royalty, and this diversity showed up in many of his texts, which was positive. Gower, on the other hand, is a bit more mysterious. Historians don't really know what his profession actually was. He received payments for lots of different activities, but nothing's definitive. So I can say he sometimes worked in law, and I can say he sometimes received payments for the transfer of goods. Whereas Chaucer wrote primarily in English, Gower wrote his works in French, Latin, and English according to his audience's need. And at the time, Gower would have been seen as a more refined poet, but Chaucer was the more people's poet, I guess you could say. Okay, so then we get to Sir Thomas Malory. The Arthurian cycle of legends is well known by now. You guys know Arthur and his knights. Arthur's name and fortunes have long since passed into legend. This was powerfully assisted by the appearance of an early bestseller composed in the 15th century by a wayward knight named Sir Thomas Malory. Oh, good gracious. Historians, they understate his reputation. Historical records indicate that Malory may have been in prison for assault, stealing a horse, or rape. He definitely didn't live up to the chivalric ideal that he wrote about. In fact, it's likely that some of his work was written while he was in prison. So, there we go. The full title of his work is The Birth, Life, and Acts of King Arthur, of his Noble Knights of the Round Table, Their Marvelous Inquests and Adventures, The Achieving of the Sangreal, and in the end, the Dolorous Death and Departing out of the World of them all. That was 3 lines long, so it's easy to see why Malory's publisher, William Caxton, named this 800 to 1,000 page work Le Morte-d'Arthur, a romantic title by which it has been known and admired since. Whew, okay, again, long, but we're done. Next week, we're moving on to early modern English, so that one is far more understandable by comparison. You'll be much more comfortable with it. As always, email me with questions.